Hi there, welcome to Nomadic Diaries. We're the podcast that takes you on journeys through the lives of those who have already embraced the international lifestyles. Whether you're an expat, a digital nomad, or someone who's dreaming of those lifestyles, this is your passport to a world of insight. We dive deep into the hearts and minds of the overseas lifestyle professionals, the authors, and researchers. Join us in this fun adventure as we deconstruct all the elements of expat and nomadic lifestyles, one captivating story at a time. Hello, listeners. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful blue planet. It is my privilege today to introduce you to the wonderful Sarah Deschamps. Welcome to Nomadic Diaries. Let me just give you a little background. Sarah has lived overseas and she has written a book called Journey to Japan, a life-saving memoir. And today we're going to dig into what it is to live the overseas lifestyle and how to have some strategies to manage the challenges that come with the intercultural healthcare systems. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and energy, Sarah.
I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much, Doreen, for the invitation.
You're welcome. Please, could you just give us a little introduction, a little bit of a setup to how the book came about and just the background of your story?
Absolutely. So my husband and I were in college together and absolutely loved to travel, both of us, and anything international we could do, we wanted to do. So during my college time, I traveled to South America, spent 6 months, a semester there. I traveled to China. I traveled to Spain. And after that, Fred, my husband, and I lived in Brussels together, where he's from in Belgium, and realized soon after we got married in the 90s that we wanted to live in a place that was neither of our homes, to experience not the United States, not Europe or Belgium specifically, but to go to a country that was new and different, to experience it together. So we had the opportunity when I had a 2.5-year-old and was pregnant to move to Tokyo, Japan. Now, most people would take pause at that. And do you really want to move to Tokyo? But for us, it was the thrill of a lifetime. We were so excited to finally reach this goal and move abroad. So I spoke with my doctors and asked them here in the US if they agreed that I could go. They were hesitant because why would anybody move when you're pregnant to give birth abroad in a country where they don't speak English? And then he looked at me and realized, oh, this is somebody who really, really wants to go abroad and really wants to travel and experience this. So he said, let's do a few tests before we go, before we were to leave. And in the process of doing those tests, I was 5 months pregnant, and the doctors looked and thought they saw in the ultrasound that maybe there was something wrong with the baby. Maybe there was a dark shadow in the lower abdomen. They weren't sure what it was, and sent us to a high-risk pregnancy clinic. This is now a few weeks before my husband is leaving for Tokyo. Went to the appointment, and the doctor again said in a high-risk clinic, not sure, but maybe there's something in the lower abdomen of your baby, but the baby's small and in a tight position, so not sure. I decided at that moment that there was outstanding healthcare in Japan. Fred had heard about a friend of ours who'd given birth in Tokyo, and there was excellent healthcare, a fantastic doctor who works with expatriates, and we were sure this was the thing to do. So ultimately, when I was 8 months pregnant, holding my 2.5-year-old daughter's hand, we got on an airplane, left Minnesota, and flew to Tokyo to start this new life. Soon after we arrived, days after we arrived, we went to meet the doctor who was the one that worked with expatriates. He was fantastic. It was an American-style clinic. He spoke perfect English. He was educated all over the world himself and was fantastic, exactly what I wanted. He did tests and ultrasound and said, stopped them in the middle of the tests and said, I cannot see you anymore. You must go to a level 3 trauma hospital. He gave me a piece of paper, square size of origami, and said, take this piece of paper with you, take all of your bag of ultrasounds, etc., notes from the United States, and go to this clinic. Wow. It was written, not only was the note written in Japanese, but he told us that they only speak Japanese at that clinic. So the next day, my husband and I got in a taxi, handed the taxi driver what's called a meishi, a little piece of paper, a card, business card size that had the name of the hospital on it. So not knowing where we were going, we drove away from our new apartment. Someone was taking care of a friend in the apartment building, someone that we knew from the company my husband was at, was taking, so someone our daughter didn't know, was taking care of the 2.5-year-old. We drive off in a taxi, go to the hospital, and are immediately thrown into something so far from what we ever dreamed or thought would happen. And that was that it was kind of a rundown hospital, 1960s looking, concrete floors, dark linoleum, intimidating. No one spoke English. We finally figured out at the front desk, which was even hard to find, that you take a number and that number will be called in order for a doctor to come get you to go see them. But we didn't even know what kind of doctor we were going to see. And we didn't know how to say numbers in Japanese. And so we sat there uncomfortably in this waiting room, waiting. Ultimately, we figured out, because everyone in the room was looking at us, to please stand up, you crazy foreigners. That number 18 had been called and you need to go. We went to the doctor. The doctor did another ultrasound. And this doctor did speak English. And she said, we don't know. That was always the answer. We don't know. At this point, I'm 8 months pregnant. Let's wait until the baby's born. There's nothing immediate that has to happen. And the only caveat was, when we came back to that level 3 trauma hospital, my husband was not allowed to come with me. So the rules of the hospital were that I had to come alone.
Oh my.
So I was realizing that what I had hoped for and dreamed for, and my husband and I had wanted for so long, was never going to happen. And I was stuck. There was no turning back. There was no airplane home, because I was past the date in which I could fly on an airplane. So we were stuck. So stuff arrived, as should be a glorious experience, where the movers come and put all your belongings from Minnesota, in our case, into our apartment. We quickly unpacked everything. Minutes after that happened, my water broke in the middle of the night. And so at 4:00 in the morning, I said goodbye to my husband. He then stayed home with our 2.5-year-old. And we knew we would not see each other again until we had a new baby. So I got in a taxi, showed the taxi driver again this meishi, the business card, about where I wanted to go. And at that point, I could say the name of the hospital, which was Joshi Idai Byoen. Byoen means hospital. So he took me to the hospital. Luckily, he knew where it was. It turned out that what was the emergency room of this hospital was a tiny door, and above the door was a sign that the driver pointed to me, because I wasn't about to get out of the taxi if I couldn't see this was really the hospital. It did say emergency, and off to the left side were all the garbage bins of the hospital. So that is how I entered the hospital in order to give birth to my baby. I stood there because no one knew that I was coming. The doctor finally came down, the one that we had met, and now I'm waiting to go into labor. So she brought me to a room where there were 10 women in a row with sheets, curtains pulled between us, very small area. And we were all waiting to go into labor. And she said, you will stay here until labor actually starts. So for almost 2 days, I sat there eating whole fish with the eyeballs, with
Oh,
with chopsticks, which was fine. I could certainly eat with chopsticks. I was not naive as a traveler or explorer or person who loved foreign culture. I was naive as somebody who was forced into a cross-cultural experience I never, ever wanted, neither for myself, nor my family, nor certainly not this tiny baby that was about to come into the world.
oh
Finally,
my.
2 days later, I was taken to what we would now say is an operating room. It was not a birthing room. It was not comfortable as it had been for my 2.5-year-old at that point
Yes.
in Minnesota. This was a sterile room. They put
Mhm.
me on the operating table, and I gave birth to a baby who was breech, which means her head came out first. She had the
Mhm.
umbilical cord wrapped around her neck,
Mhm.
and they whisked her away. There were 6 doctors at my feet, all standing there, very intimidating as I'm giving birth. And they took the baby away. I never saw her. And they allowed me at that point to call my husband. And I said, okay, they will let you in now. He came to the hospital and they stitched me up. And about 3 hours later, I was standing on my feet. No problem. Never once again thought about myself, because how could I? They took us, not telling us where we were going, but we ended up in the neonatal intensive care unit of this hospital, which you had to have sterile gown, which is normal. Of course, you would have a sterile gown. They
Sure.
had Japanese slippers that you
Yes.
would use to go in. And so we took off our shoes and put those shoes on, went in and couldn't find our baby. It turned out there were 15 babies all around the perimeter of this room. And finally, the doctor pointed, because we didn't know which one was ours. We ran over, saw her. She looked beautiful and perfect. And as I was looking into the baby bassinet, admiring my beautiful child, all kinds of doctors and nurses started surrounding both and me. And they're in and saw that her right ear was missing. And then I pulled away and saw all the cords and wires and buzzers and things that were attached to her, and realized there would be so much more wrong with that tiny baby. It turned out that the baby needed to have immediately a surgery, because she was born with something called cloacal malformation, which is a dark shadow in the lower abdomen. So everyone had been correct. And the dark shadow in the lower abdomen means that the baby's bladder and bowel were fused together as one.
Oh
And there's
my.
no hole for the outside for any of these toxic wastes to leave her body. So she would have died immediately if she hadn't had surgery when she's only a few hours old.
Oh my.
So that is the setup for how we ended up in the medical system. And there's many more pieces to the story, but I think it's helpful to hear how we got where we were, that we didn't, of course, wish this upon ourselves nor anyone, and the reaction that we had to our daughter having surgery 12 hours after she's born, and then remaining in that neonatal intensive care unit for 5 weeks. And I had to visit her every day during visiting hours, and they were restricted, and there were many rules placed on us as parents, and all the parents, Japanese or otherwise,
Oh
about
yeah.
how to be in Japan and in level 3 trauma hospital.
I can only imagine. To me, this is very vivid because, as you know, I also lived in Japan, and many of our listeners know I had a miscarriage in Japan. So I could visualize the hospital and all of the trepidation that you're experiencing and working in a foreign culture. Number one, we think it's only language, but it's not. It's language and culture and procedures and systems. So
Exactly.
this is a very visceral story for me. So you find yourself in Japan with this tiny baby who has had surgery, managing healthcare while you were abroad. Could you walk us through the experience of how long you stayed in Japan and just sort of the general outline of that process with saving your child and working through the health system?
So maybe the surprising part to your listeners is how much we desperately wanted to continue our experience in Japan. even with this in front of this traumatic, dramatic, incredibly important, life-saving of our daughter experience, we still wanted to stay. We remained in Japan for 7 years.
7 whole years. And I have to say, the other birth experience that I think about in Japan is my mother-in-law went with 6 kids and came back with 8 and had to get on an airplane to fly to another island to go to a different base where they had healthcare facilities, because in the base that she was stationed on, they didn't have any facilities for her. So it is really traumatic. And this episode, I think, is a tribute to the resilience of international women.
I think for many of your listeners, I hope they'll be able to relate to the idea that there is this deep desire to make anywhere in the world work.
Yes.
And that we wanted, even though we went down a cross-cultural path multiple times to save our daughter's life, we still wanted to stay. And I think the important part of that is on the days we weren't going to hospitals or doctors or planning experiences to travel to Los Angeles, which is ultimately where several of the surgeries for our daughter were. She had 7 operations during our 7 years in Japan.
Oh my.
When we opened the door on the day that we just carried our baby with a bag of medical things just in case at our side, the adventure of a lifetime happened every single day. Fred, my husband, and I used to say, you open that front door and anything good, interesting, unique can happen to you. And that left us with this thrill. Our baby was safe. We could protect her. We knew what the medical care was that she still needed, which was tremendous. But we had our 2.5-year-old with us in a backpack on my husband's back, baby on my front, and off we went. And we did as much travel, as much unique experiences as we could while we were there.
And that is such a gift, I think, to the subconscious mind, because when I talk to my daughter, she doesn't remember very much about living in Japan as a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-year-old, right? But I believe that that subconscious experience comes through and shows up in later. And for instance, she just had a wedding shower and we had an ikebana. We had ikebana training for all the women at the wedding shower. And I'm thinking, how is this relatable? Because we cannot tie the experiences that you have subconsciously when you're living internationally to like black and white things that happen in life, but many of them do show up later. So do your daughters have any affinity for Japan at this point?
So your listeners, I hope, will love this connection. Lily, so our daughter whose life was saved and now she's 23 and has a job and a wonderful life. When she moved back and to Minnesota, which is the original place, the place we landed when we came back 7 years later, people would ask her, "Hi, where are you from?" And they were thinking Minneapolis, some other city. And so it was a true part of who she was. And our older daughter, who's now 26, and life is very good for her as well, same thing. I grew up in Japan. My first friendships were in Tokyo. My life was there. It's a huge part of our lives still to this day, all these years later.
Yes, we feel that too. And people coming into our house notice the white wedding kimono on the wall, and they notice the kimono stand. I mean, it's evident, it's evident in the things that we carry with us, but it's also evident, I think, in the subconscious mind and the way we maybe think about things, because I do believe we pack up a culture and pack a little bit of it with us. So what are some of the key lessons that you learned that you might share with other men or women who find themselves in a very disorientating, scary, overwhelming situation that they have no control over, partly because of the rules or the regulations, which are actually cultural.
In some ways, wish someone would have asked me that question, not before Lily was born, because I was going to go to Japan no matter what. Fred and I had made the decision. We were so excited. We couldn't be stopped. But I wish when Lily had been born and was in the neonatal intensive care unit for 5 weeks, that someone would have said, pulled me aside gently over a nice sushi lunch or dinner and said, Sarah, let's stop for a minute. Let's reevaluate. How are you going to move forward? What is it that you need in place in order to make what is clearly a critically difficult medical situation work?
Yes.
And instead, I'm not sure I could hear that, in all honesty, even when Lily was in the NICU, but I wish that someone gently would have told me, and maybe they did. If my mother was standing next to me and she came minutes after Lily, got on a plane minutes after Lily was born, and she probably told me, Sarah, it's probably a good idea to come back to Minnesota. Or my mother-in-law came the second month and she probably said multiple times, Sarah, let's go back. And so maybe it was my own obstinance and certainly my naivete, but I wish I would have stopped, reevaluated the situation. I don't know that that would have made me go home or made Fred and I make different decisions. We knew we would be apart if we made that kind of a decision.
Yes,
Fred had a job, a really big job in Tokyo. He had to stay. The company had just sent him there. So we would have lived apart. And we didn't want that. We wanted to raise our girls together in Japan. So I'm not, again, maybe people did tell me to stop and reevaluate, but I wish I would have had that sage advice. And I wish I could have heard it and listened to it. I don't know that I still would have done anything different. By then, I was so deeply committed to being in Japan and so fascinated by the culture. The rules were frustrating. You could only see your baby for 2 hours a day. I was nursing this baby, so I would express milk. I brought milk. I hoped they fed that milk to my baby. I didn't know. My husband was allowed in. Fred was allowed in, but he had to work. So the only way he could see a baby, because from 1 to 3 in the afternoon, it was a half hour or 45 minutes just to get to the hospital. He couldn't. So the burden fell on me. The rules were strict. I think I still would have stayed.
Yes. And that really is a very positive message in terms of when you have a vision or a dream of living an international life, there are unintended consequences. And there are unintended consequences of making all these major decisions in life. The difference is you get to evaluate them and do a risk analysis assessment for yourself. And everybody's risk analysis is very, very different.
Correct.
And so you took the information you had, applied it to your particular life's journey, and made this decision. So how did you cope with the emotional and logistical challenges, like over the months, like over the first 2 or 3 years that you were there when you had, because I know that Japan is absolute heaven for little kids. It's the most fun country I've ever been to for little kids.
And our daughter, Emma, the older one, was in a lovely preschool and learning Japanese and coming home and bowing and saying words and thrilled to make friends from all over the world in the expatriate community. And since Fred is from Belgium and I'm from the US, we wanted that internationalism. She ultimately met people from 35 countries around the world. So the thrill of that was huge. However, we had this baby who needed attention all the time. So we tried to make it work in Japan. Lily needed to have one of the single most complicated medical surgeries that exist aside from a heart surgery. And she had to have it in the first year of life. So we had to find a doctor who could do that reconstructive surgery, separate her bladder, separate her bowel in her teeny tiny little body, and make them so they would function. The doctor that had helped me and had done the first surgery when she's 12 hours old, told us that he could do this reconstructive surgery. He had done a one or two of them, and he could do them if we wanted. The appeal of that is not knowing the complexity at that point. Fred and I could remain. We could have our life in Japan. I would spend quite a bit of it in a hospital with Lily, but we could continue. What we realized was that there are actually 3 doctors in the world at that time, which was the year 2000, who had done hundreds of these reconstructive surgeries. And we realized we could not stay in Japan. And that created so many more problems, which again, many of your listeners might relate to, which is half of our family was in the United States, in our case, having surgical procedures. But I know there are many more reasons why people have to come back. And Fred had to stay. We needed his medical insurance. We needed the financial income. We knew this would be very expensive, even with insurance, to take care of Lily and to make sure she got the very best care. So there came a point when we had to, because there was no other option, leave Japan.
And so you traveled back to LA for a surgery?
So one of the 3 surgeons was in Los Angeles, and we flew and we met him when Lily was 7 months old. He did this major reconstructive surgery. For her, it was a 12-hour operation. And lucky for us, hugely successful. Then we were connected to Los Angeles because this medical anomaly, this rare disease, requires multiple surgeries. So then we knew we were committed for years to come back to Los Angeles. And with Fred staying in Japan, so what happened was I would plan for months and months and months for this, organizing the surgery with Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. Emma, the older daughter, and I and Lily would fly to Los Angeles for all the pre-surgical work. Fred would fly from Tokyo to Los Angeles. We stayed at the Ronald McDonald House. For anyone who knows that, it's a miraculous place and brings respite and hope for families. And we would stay there for 2 or 3 months. And Fred would come for the surgery and he'd fly back to Japan and work from Los Angeles on a different time zone. So again, the complications that came from a child with multiple medical issues, that then we were cross-cultural. And that's really when it was sad and hard and challenging on a marriage to be able to overcome what had to happen. We were all in, but it was tough.
Yeah, that's very, very tough. They say resilience is built during tough times, and it's important to sway like a palm tree. But, you know, when you're fully extended like that, traveling the globe, trying to establish systems somewhere else, that's very, very challenging.
And Los Angeles was neither of our homes. My family was in Minnesota and his in Belgium. And so again, we were not landing where there was network or support or friends. We knew a couple people, but nothing like what we had in either of our home cities.
It's a very, very isolating experience, isn't it?
Yes.
And so how did your experience in Tokyo kind of shape your perspective on healthcare systems and access? Have you had interactions with healthcare in any other countries?
Personally, not in Europe, but certainly all my family members on Fred's side are still in Europe. So I'm amazed at socialist healthcare that allows individuals to be taken care of no matter what, for no price, for and outstanding care. The comparison I personally can express is between Japan and the US. We've had procedures and operations since we came back to the US. And that comparison is interesting. Japanese medical system is extremely paternalistic.
Yes.
And the doctors are called sensei, which means professor or teacher. They are revered by everyone in the hospital and by the parents and patients as well. Paternalistic in the case of our situation meant, one, I was the patient, they were in charge, and Fred could do nothing. And it didn't matter that I needed support because I was the patient.
Yes.
Then with Lily in the neonatal intensive care unit, same thing. It took a long time for us to truly understand the intricacies of exactly what was wrong and what was needed to care for her. She
Yes.
stayed in the NICU for 5 weeks.
Yes.
The comparison I have to that is in Los Angeles, where doctors would explain intensely in detail what had to happen. They wanted to make sure both
Yes.
Fred and I understood. And that was fantastic and sort of a shock to the system. The downfall, however, of that system is then allowing parents to take over, if you will, at a time when you're not quite ready. So after, especially having been in the Japanese system where somebody else is in charge, and will not let you be in charge.
Yeah. Suddenly you have freedom and you're like, I have to make decisions. I have to make choices. There's pressure with these choices because I'm not prepared for them, right?
Exactly. I mean, the perfect example of that is when Lily came out of the hospital after the 12-hour surgery. She had been in the hospital for about 10 days. And they handed over this beautiful baby who had stitches and staples and cuts all over her body and said, yeah, it's okay to give her a bath. And yeah, it's okay to feed her and take care of her. And I was frightened to my core that they believed that I could do this, especially since she'd been in a place where if she had been born in the United States, after 2 days, they would have shown me how to take care of her and sent me on my way with my baby. And in Los Angeles, professionals and other doctors in the United States don't do that. So I've learned how to do it, of course, but that was a shock at how different the systems truly are. In good ways, both of them. I have nothing bad to say about the Japanese system. Those doctors, those nurses, even though they didn't speak English, communicated with me. One nurse spent hours writing out the discharge note for me, translating it word for word. This is before Google Translate, from Japanese into English. And she said in perfect English, do you understand what you need to do to take care of yourself? And handed me that paper. So the kindness and care and almost love of taking care of me as a patient was overwhelming.
And my listeners are probably tired of hearing my tales of living in Mexico is a little similar. The doctors here, when I had COVID, would call, what's your numbers today? Texting, what's your blood pressure? And there's just a different sense of care. I still haven't figured it out in all the countries I've lived in. Is it more heart? Is it more head? Are we just sort of in different spaces? There's all this navigating the consciousness and the culture, which is just can be so overwhelming. So when you reflect on your journey, what are some of the key factors that you think, now you were a very determined person, clearly, and very focused. Are there other factors other than that really contributed to successfully managing this 7-year journey?
I think the most important takeaway from my experience is never give up. Persevere no matter what, and love where you live. Don't be angry that the Japanese handle it differently than in the United States. Don't be angry that the system is a different way. It is that way. And it's okay if you don't like it or you don't feel that it's doing what you need, but that's what the system is. So I think what's important is we did ultimately realize we go to one of those 3 doctors in the world. That meant moving our family halfway. But we didn't leave Japan, and we went back permanently, surgery after surgery, until Lily was whole. After those 7 surgeries, our daughter was whole. Her body was put back together. And in some ways, it was a sign to me that it was okay to go home. The Japanese and the Japanese system had done everything we needed. The doctors in Los Angeles, who are our heroes, saved her life multiple times as well. And it was okay to leave then. And there was deep sadness on our part to leave Japan.
I still live with that. I think we all do. We package up these, like I said earlier, we package these cultures and somehow we carry them inside ourselves, right? And so I can really identify with the sense of revere and honoring of what the doctors and the nurses did for you. Have you had any insight into how you can translate that cultural experience to the Western healthcare services?
It's interesting you ask that. Lily has had 7 more operations since we moved back to the United States. And we have continued our, maybe to relate to your listeners, a nomadic lifestyle, and that we moved from Minnesota to Washington, D.C., to Seattle, to Florida, and finally back to Minnesota. And in each of those places have had operations and experiences. And I think the translation is to be patient, but the most important thing is to know everything you possibly can about your medical situation. Mm-hmm. So I jokingly, and now for years, have said I have a PhD and MD in Lily. And no one else owns that degree. Yes. And that I can recite every number, like your doctors during COVID. I can answer those questions with every number that she has, every medical, surgical intervention that she's had, so that I can be a walking medical record for her if ever it's needed. And I don't think I would have carried that as much of a burden, if you will, or as with such reverence and importance in my life, if I hadn't had the experience in Japan. I ultimately, no matter the paternalistic system, was in charge. It was on me and Fred, of course, to constantly save Lily's life.
Because you are a walking, and I've forgotten the term. What is the terminology when they respect the elders in Japan? You're a walking museum. There's a term for it where they revere the elders so much. And they're like walking systems of wisdom. I've forgotten the term for it, but I will look it up before we publish this so that we can make that part of the headline, because you became that.
Exactly. And to the point that by the end, Lily had had an operation in Los Angeles where she needed to have a cast on her arm after surgery on her thumb. We moved back to Japan after the cast was put on, and I was so used to dealing with so many medical systems, it really didn't occur to me in as important a way that we had to have a cast removed in Japan. And so she wore that cast for 6 months, and I found a clinic. I found a doctor. We walked in. I said, "You have to take off this cast. You're an orthopedic surgeon. Please do it." He didn't speak any English. He didn't understand. I pointed to the cast. I knew of his background. So it truly was an ability to advocate for myself, but certainly for my daughter.
Yes, you become a very, very professional advocate for yourself when you are overseas. And this is one of the unforeseen consequences of, I think, personal growth and commitment to an international lifestyle, is the willingness to show up knowing that dangerous, negative things can happen. However, in the outworking of these, sometimes the universe or whatever we believe in has different ideas, right?
Yeah. One thing might be important to say is Emma, who was the 2.5-year-old, we found her a pediatrician, and she went to get her regular vaccinations, and the growth chart and the normal things that happened, and ultimately just went to a doctor as you would in the United States. So she got to experience, if you will, the normal medical system. So I hope upon your listeners that that's the one they get to experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been an absolutely wonderful experience. Thank you so much for being so transparent and such a resource for people. So if our listeners are looking to connect with you and read the book, where can they find you, Sarah?
So my website is my name, sarahdeschamps.com, and that's Sarah, S-A-R-A-H. Deschamps is spelled DESCHAMPS.com.
Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate this. Now, I have 2 lightning round questions for you. You live currently in Minnesota. And so I want you to imagine that you've been banished to a desert island and you can take one dish from Minnesota with you, one favorite food. What would that be?
Well, in Minnesota, we make hot dishes. So you have to, from the Midwest, bring a hot dish. And most hot dishes have potatoes and cheese. Now, I would not claim that I make hot dishes, but if I was going to that desert island and showing off my native city state, that's what I would bring.
And second question is, imagine that you are the godmother and the custodian of all expatriate superpowers, and that you can gift one superpower to each of our listeners today that they can carry with them on their international expatriate or nomadic journey. What one invisible superpower would you wish upon our listeners?
Joy. I would wish upon your listeners that they find joy and magic in all of their experiences. And I bring that to you, having just told you the story. I tried every day to open that door and find joy and happiness and wonder in the fact that I got to live abroad and how lucky I was to fulfill that dream.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been such a pleasure. And listeners, if you would like to follow Sarah, you can find all her information in the show notes. And please don't forget to let us know who you are and where you are and what you might like to possibly hear. And like and subscribe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.